Let me show you how to be a good Bayesian.
Today's episode takes us into the dynamic intersection of Bayesian statistics and sports analytics with none other than Patrick Ward, the Director of Research and Analysis for the Seattle Seahawks. With a rich background that spans from the Nike Sports Research Lab to teaching statistics, Patrick brings a wealth of knowledge to the table. In our discussion, Patrick delves into how Bayesian methods are revolutionizing the way we understand player performance and manage injury risks in professional sports. He sheds light on the particular challenges of translating complex Bayesian concepts for coaches and team managers who may not be versed in statistical methods but need to leverage these insights for strategic decisions. Patrick also walks us through the practical aspects of applying Bayesian stats in the high-stakes world of the NFL. From selecting the right players to optimizing training loads, he illustrates the profound impact that thoughtful statistical analysis can have on a team's success and players' health. For those of you who appreciate the blend of science and strategy, this conversation offers a behind-the-scenes look at the sophisticated analytics powering team decisions. And when he's not dissecting data or strategizing for the Seahawks, Patrick enjoys the simple pleasures of reading, savoring coffee, and playing jazz guitar. This is Learning Bayesian Statistics, episode 111, recorded June 19, 2024.
Let me show you how to be a good Bayesian. Change your predictions after taking information in. And if you're thinking I'll be less than amazing, let's adjust those expectations. What's a Bayesian? It's someone who cares about evidence.
Welcome to Learning Bayesian Statistics, a podcast about Bayesian inference, the methods, the projects, and the people who make it possible. I'm your host, Alex Andorra. You can follow me on Twitter at Alex_Andorra, like the country. For any info about the show, learnbayesstats.com is the place to be. Show notes, becoming a corporate sponsor, unlocking Bayesian merch, supporting the show on Patreon, everything is in there. That's learnbayesstats.com. If you're interested in one-on-one mentorship, online courses, or statistical consulting, feel free to reach out and book a call at topmate.io/Alex_Andorra. See you around, folks, and best Bayesian wishes to you all. And if today's discussion sparked ideas for your business, well, our team at PIMC Labs can help bring them to life. Check us out at PIMC-labs.com.
Hello, my dear Bayesians! I have some exciting personal news to share with you. I am thrilled to announce that I have recently taken on a new role as a senior applied scientist with the Miami Marlins. In this position, I'll be diving even deeper into the world of sports analytics, leveraging Bayesian modeling, of course, to enhance team performance and player development. And honestly, this move is so exciting to me and solidifies my commitment to advancing the application of Bayesian stats in sports. So if you find yourself in Miami, or if you're curious about the intersection of Bayesian methods in baseball, or team sports in general, don't hesitate to reach out. Okay, back to the show now. Patrick Ward, welcome to Learning Bayesian Statistics.
Oh, thanks for having me. I listened to every episode. It's I think every year at the end of the year, Spotify tells me that it's one of my highly listened to podcasts. So it's a pleasure to be here. Hopefully, I don't know if I can live up to your prior. You've had some pretty big timers, but yeah.
No, yeah. So first, thanks a lot for being such a faithful listener. I definitely appreciate that. And I'm always amazed at the diversity of people who listen to the show. That's really awesome. And also I want to thank Scott Morrison, who put us in contact. Scott is working at the Miami Marlins. He's a fellow colleague now. That's a change for me, but that's a great change. I'm extremely excited about that new step in my life. But today we're not going to talk a lot about baseball. We're going to talk a lot about US football. So today, European listeners, when you hear about football, we're going to talk about the American football, the one with a ball that looks like a rugby ball. And so, Patrick, we're going to talk about that. But first, as usual, I want to talk a bit more about you. Can you tell the listeners what you're doing nowadays? So I gave your title, in your bio in the intro, but maybe tell us a bit more in the flesh what you're doing and also how you ended up doing what you're doing.
Yeah, well, currently I'm at the Seattle Seahawks, which is one of the American football teams in the NFL. And I'm the director of research and analysis there. So we kind of work across all of football operations. So everything from player acquisition, front office type of stuff to team-based analysis and opponent analysis, and just kind of coordinating a research strategy around how we attack questions for the key decision makers or the key stakeholders across coaching, acquisition, and even into player health and performance and development and things like that. And I got here, this is my 10th year. I got here from Nike. So I was at Nike in the sports research lab, actually working for nearly 2 years as a researcher. And the way that I got here was I was doing some projects for Nike around applied sports research. And they had just, at the time, I think they had just become like the biggest sponsor of the newly minted National Women's Soccer League. And they said, oh, we want to do something around this. And so, we were kind of kicking around ideas. And one of the ideas we had was, what if we went out and we tested all of the women in the league, tested them on sprinting and jumping and power output and things like that. And then we could basically build like archetypes, and that would be useful for, like apps in your watch and on your phone, and girls in the field could compare themselves to their favorite athletes and stuff. So they let us do it. And they sent me on the road for an entire offseason, the entire offseason training of the National Women's Soccer League. I went around the country to every single team, myself and 4 colleagues, and we tested every woman in the league. And so we had the largest data set on women's soccer players that anyone could have. So we did some conference presentations and things like that with that data. And lo and behold, Nike, I was there, and the Seattle Seahawks called down to Nike and said, hey, we hear there's this test battery and we'd love to see what our players do on it. And so I went up and I did a project for them around that. And then they kind of just said, like, what if you just did this kind of stuff all the time? And so that's how I started out 10 years ago. And I basically started out just in applied physiology, which was my background. And I was doing wearable tech for the team, like GPS and accelerometry and things like that. And then that kind of progressed into draft analysis and player evaluation and things like that. And it just kind of kept growing until 10 years later, here we are.
Yeah, that's a great, it's a great background. I love it because, definitely it seems like you've been into sports since you're at least a college graduate, but also there is a bit of randomness in this. So I really love that. Of course, as a fellow Bayesian, always interested in the random parts of anybody's journey. In how much of Bayesian stats do you have in that journey and also in your current work? How Bayesian in a way is your work right now, but also how were you introduced to Bayesian stats?
Yeah, well, anyone who's watched American football knows it's a game of very, very small sample sizes. So we only play up until 2 years ago. We play 17 games now. We used to only play 16 games. So unlike most of the other sports, baseball's got 162, several hundred at bats. basketball, hockey, 82 games, many attempts. Also, the players in a lot of these sports are all doing the same things. In baseball, aside from the pitchers, everybody's going to go to the plate and hit. In basketball, everybody has a chance on the court to dribble the ball, shoot, score, pass, get assists, get blocks, etc. Football is really unique because it's a very tactical game. There's discrete events in terms of plays stop and start, but because of the tactical nature of it and one ball, there's only certain positions that touch the ball. There's only certain opportunities that players are going to have. So that was always an issue. And when I did my PhD, a big part of my PhD was using mixed models to look at physiological differences between players and on the field with GPS and accelerometry. And I always thought of mixed models, even though I didn't know it at the time because I hadn't really learned anything Bayesian yet. I always thought of mixed models. I think of them as like this bridge to Bayesian analysis because you have these fixed effects which behave like our population, averages, our population base rates, I guess you could say. And the random effects are sort of like, hey, we know something about you or your group, and therefore we know how you deviate from the population. And then with those two bits of information, we're also like, hey, here's someone new in the population, or maybe someone that we've only seen or observed do the thing one time. Our best guess, therefore, is the fixed effects portion of this until proven otherwise. So I always had that in the back of my head going through this. But, my first 2 or 3 years in the NFL, we always just used to kind of throw our hands up when we see small samples. We'd be like, it's 50%, but it's such a small sample, we can't really know. And we didn't really have a good way of like sorting out what to do with that information because as you know, something like 1 out of 10 and 10 out of 100 and, 100 out of 1,000, those are the same proportions, but different levels of information are contained within those proportions. And I stumbled upon a paper, it was like 1977 or something by Efron and Morris, and it was called the Stein's Paradox. And I probably stumbled on it because I was like, there's so much in sabermetrics. Someone in baseball has probably figured this out before. And so I was probably Googling something like small samples, baseball statistics, sabermetrics, blah, blah, blah. And I stumbled upon this paper about Stein's Paradox. And the crux of the paper was, if we observe these, I think it was 12 or 18 baseball players through the first half of the season up to the All-Star break, and we see the number of times they went to the plate and what their, the number of times they hit, we have a batting average. If we take the observed batting average through the first half of the season, how well does that predict the batting average at the end of the season, meaning now they've gone through the second half? And so you look at that and you're like, okay, let's, what's this all about? And so the first thing they do is they set up this argument that like, well, that doesn't do a very good job because some of these players batted, 5 times or 3 times. Certainly a player who went 3 for 3 has 100% batting average. We don't think this is the greatest baseball player of all time yet because we've only seen him do this thing 3 times. So, the basic naive prediction of using the first half of the season to predict the second half wasn't very good. And so in that paper, they introduced this kind of simple Bayesian model of saying, well, we know something about average baseball players. What if we weighted everybody to that? And lo and behold, that did a bit better of a job, constraining the small sampled players who had these, a guy that goes 0 for 10, which is totally possible in baseball when you have hundreds of at-bats. We don't think that's the worst hitter in baseball. And so, constraining those players told them something about what they expected to then see at the end of the season. And so through that paper, then I found this blog by David Robinson, who's an R programmer. And it was all about like using empirical Bayesian analysis for baseball. And then he made it into a nice little book that you could buy on Amazon for like, I don't know, $20 or something. And, and I read those 2 things and I was like, oh, this is incredible. This is exactly what I've always wanted to know. And so like I went in the next day to our other analysts. At the time, there was only 2 of us. And I said, I think I figured out a way we could solve small sample problems. And that was it. Like then after that, you really couldn't convince me otherwise that this wasn't a great way of thinking. That doesn't mean that everything we do has to be Bayesian. Certainly, like, there's other things that we do that are use, different tools like machine learning models and neural networks and things like that. But certainly when we start thinking about like decision making, how do I incorporate priors, domain expertise? How do I fit the right prior? Like if you went 0 for 5 in your first at bats, let's say in baseball, but you were a college standout and you were an amazing player in the AAA, I probably have a stronger prior that you're maybe a slightly better than average baseball player than if you went 0 for 5 and you were a horrific college player and you weren't very good in AAA and you were really the last person on the bench that we needed to call. And maybe that prior is much lower. And so utilizing that information in order to help us make decisions going forward, that's really where that was kind of the money for me. And so how much do we use it? I mean, if we have a new analyst start, like one of our new analysts starts, she started 2 years ago. I think the first thing was like, how much do you know about Bayes? And it's like, well, I never really learned that in school and blah, blah, blah. And it was like, okay, here's 2 books. Here's a 12-week curriculum. We're going to meet every week and you're going to do projects and homework and reading. And that was it. Like, it was like, you have to learn this because this is how we're going to think. And this is how we're going to process information and communicate information.
Well, what about that? I told the listeners that we were not gonna talk a lot about baseball, but in the end we are.
It all comes back to baseball, I think. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, in sports analytics, it always all comes back to baseball, right?
Certainly, yeah. Certainly.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That's so. If I understand correctly, that basically that was motivated a lot by basically low sample sizes and being able to handle all of that in your models. So, and that makes a ton of sense. Mm-hmm. And as a lot of people I've seen it, a lot of clients, definitely motivated by a very practical problem that you were having. So yeah, I mean, most of people enter the Bayesian field through that. Something that I'm actually very curious about, because like I could keep talking about that for hours, but I really want to dive into what you're doing at the Seahawks, and also how Bayesian stats is helpful to what you guys are doing. I think it's the most interesting for the listeners who understand basically how themselves could they apply Bayesian stats to their own problems, which are not necessarily in sports, but I think sports is a really good field to think about that, because you have a lot of diversity and you have also a lot of somewhat controlled experiments. You have a lot of constraints, and that's always extremely interesting to talk about that. So maybe you can start by basically explaining how Bayesian stats are applied in your current role for analyzing player performance and injury risk. Because now that I work directly in sports, something I'm starting to understand is that really player performance, projecting player performance, and also being able to handle injury risk are 2 extremely important topics. So maybe let's start with that. What can you tell us about that, Patrick?
Okay. Let's see. Which one should I start with? I guess I'll start with let's start with injury risk, I suppose. Injuries, like that's. I mean, this is like a super difficult problem to solve. I've written a number of papers on those. I think you can link to my ResearchGate, and there's a number of methodology papers that we've written that have looked at things like this. And I think it's complicated because, one, there's like a ton of inter-individual differences as far as why people get hurt. There's a ton of things that we probably don't know they're important yet because we can't measure them, or we at least can't measure them in the real world applied setting, maybe in a lab you can. And then there's other things that we just don't know because we're like, it's like a epistemic problem. Like we're just stupid about it. We're naive that there's other things out there that maybe we're just unaware of yet. And so it's a really hard problem to try and solve. So when I see papers that, basically come out and say like an injury prediction model, and they're estimating prediction as like a 1 or a 0, like a yes or a no, like a binary response, and they give a nice little 2x2 table and they talk about how well their model did, I'm always like, how is that useful to the people who actually have to do the work? Because in reality, what we're dealing with is it's probably not unlike a hedge fund manager managing the risk of their portfolio. And if you think of each player or each athlete that you deal with as a portfolio, they each have some level of base risk. So if we know nothing about you, you really have to have a pretty good handle in your sport of what's the base rates of risk of injury for position groups and players of different age and things like that. So that might be an initial model, right? And then from there, the players go out and they do things and they play and they perform and they compete and they get dinged up and they take hits and they get, hit by pitches, or they get tackled really hard or things like that. And we collect that information, and we're basically just shifting the probabilities up and down based on what we observe over time. And when that probability reaches a certain threshold, and of course you could use a posterior distribution. So you have an integral of like how much of the probability distribution is above or below a certain threshold. Then you have the opportunity to have a discussion about when to act or what to do. And how you act and when to act is going to be dependent on your tolerance for risk, or your coach's tolerance for risk. If it's your best player, if it's the MVP of your team, and it's week 2 of the season, and the risk probability, or let's say we're using this as a model, some of the stuff that you mentioned, Scott, earlier that we've worked on is like return to play type of models, where it's like, okay, the athlete has, saw an ankle sprain and they're rehabbing back, and we have a test or several tests, a test battery that tells us where that athlete is on their return to play timeline. Let's say it's week 2 of the season, and we say, well, there's the probability distribution, the posterior distribution looks like this. Here's the threshold that we'd feel comfortable releasing this athlete back to full-on competition. And there's a 30% chance that they're in good shape, and there's a 70% chance that they're below that threshold. In week 2 of the season, we probably want to say, you know what? Let's not take that risk this week. Let's be a little bit more risk averse here, because it is the best player. And let's wait till we have more distribution on the right side of the threshold. Alternatively, if it's the final game of the season, if it's the Super Bowl or the World Series or the Champions League final or something like that, you're going to probably take that risk because you need the best player out there. And so when I think about injury risk modeling, it's what I really think about is, how do we evaluate this individual's current status on our sort of risk score or our risk distribution? And when do we feel like we need to intervene and do something? And when are we going to feel like, hey, this is fine and continue training as is? And I think that's the tricky part. And I don't think it's not easy. I don't think I've solved anything. I don't think anyone has, but certainly from the perspective of our staff, we can all sit down with a performance staff of strength coaches and dietitians and strength coaches and medical people, and sit down and have these conversations. And what makes it nice about using a Bayesian approach is that we can also take into account domain expertise that we might not have in the data. So if we sit down on a Monday meeting and we say, oh, this player, this is where they're currently at, and this is their risk status, which I don't know, I don't really feel comfortable about. How do you feel about it? And then one of the medical people say, oh, he's been complaining that his hamstring feels really tight and he's been getting treatment every morning. Well, that's not data that we would be collecting, but that's valuable domain information that this individual who's working with the player now adds to this. And it's just like anything in probability. It's like if we have 2 or 3 or 4 independent sources all kind of converging on the same outcome or on the same endpoint, we probably need to feel really good about making that decision and saying like, hey, let's do something about this. Let's act now, right? So that's kind of how we that's how I think about it in that, from that side of things. From the performance side of things, the development side of things, it's probably going to be, it'd be way different for you guys in baseball, because you draft a player, you don't expect them to maybe get to the major leagues and contribute till 23, 24, 25 years old. For us, you draft a player and those are going to be the, next year they're playing, they're ready, they're in the mix. So in that regard, you'd be thinking of models that would probably be, in my head, I would be thinking of it as like models that are mapping the growth potential of an individual. How are they progressing through the minor leagues? Which attributes matter? And then maybe from there, answering questions like, what's the probability that this player makes, 20 starts in the major leagues, or makes, or starts for 3 seasons, or whatever endpoint makes sense to the decision makers, obviously. For us, it's more about like player identification. And again, football is a sport of small samples. And so in their college years, some of these kids might really only be a starter or a full-time player in their junior and senior year, or maybe just their senior year of college. Additionally, unlike the NFL, where, at that highest level, the talent is much more homogenous. You get to the, college football ranks and you have just this diversity of talent where you might have a big time team playing a really lower level opponent. And so, you have to adjust things. Being able to hand off the ball to your running back who's playing against a very low level opponent and he goes for 500 yards or something absurd, 200, 300 yards in a game. That has to be adjusted and weighted in some way, because it's not the same as going 200 or 300 yards against a big time opponent. And the big time opponents are more similar to the NFL players that they're going to play against. And so, all of these types of things fit into models and hierarchical models and Bayesian models, which help us utilize prior information. And the other way that the Bayesian models are useful here is, sometimes we're dealing with information that's incomplete because we can't observe all of the cases. For example, in college sport, Division I is the top division, and then you have FBS and then you Division II and Division III. So if you pull all the Division II kids that have ever made it as a pro athlete, the list is very small, but they're kids that made it. And so if you were to just build a normal model on this, it would say like, well, the best players clearly come from these lower level schools because all of the ones that we have seen have made it, have been successful. And in theory, there's hundreds of thousands of kids from that level that have never made it. So we have to adjust that model in some way. We have to weight that prior back down. Yeah, this guy is really, really good at that level, but our prior belief on him making it is very, very low. And I mean, he'd have to be so exceptional in order to, and this is where oftentimes, people rail on use weakly informative priors, let the data speak a little bit, but there are times where in these situations where I feel like you could probably put a slightly stronger prior on this and be like, man, this guy's really going to have to do something outstanding to get outside of the distribution that we believe is on this, just given what we know.
Okay, yeah, that's very interesting. That's a very good point. So it's like, yeah, related to survivor bias in a way.
Yeah.
How concretely, how do you handle these kind of cases? Is it a matter of using a different prior for these type of players, or something different?
We try to do this in a few different ways. One is you try and make basically like equivalency metrics, like saying if you did X at this low level, it in some way relates to Y at this other level. So you try and normalize players based on players that you've seen that have moved, say, between levels of the game. And so, like, again, if you think about it from a baseball perspective, you know, hitting 40 home runs in Double-A baseball might be related to, you know, might be in some way convert to like 33 home runs in Triple-A and 24 home runs in the MLB, or 12 home runs in the MLB, or whatever it might be, right? So trying to identify equivalencies between those that we can then like constrain everybody. Other ways is just like you said, like putting a prior on it. So knowing the level that the person is playing at, you would have like a lower level of prior. For example, it's just like playtime. If I think about playtime and performance as sort of this this kind of like rising curve that goes to an asymptote of some upper level of performance. The players way at the left who have very small number of observations, it would be silly to say that my prior for those players is the league average. There's a reason why they're not playing very much. It's probably because people don't think they're very good, right? So somewhere in that curve for each of those numbers of observations across whatever performance metric we're looking at, there's going to be a specific prior on that continuous distribution. And that's where I would, that's where we would kind of draw a stake in the ground and say, like, we probably think based on what we know that this player is closer to these players than he is to those players.
Okay. Yeah, I see. Yeah, definitely makes sense. And yeah, like that point of playtime already tells you something, because if the player plays less, then very probably already you have information about his level, and that means he's at least not as good as the A-level players that play much more time.
The only time you get in trouble with that is like an endowment effect, where if you like in Major League Baseball, there's been some research on players who are drafted very high in the first round, second round, get progressed up through the minor leagues faster than players who were drafted lower, even if they don't outperform those players, just because they're high as a consequence of being a high draft pick. So that one's a tricky one, but there has to be at some point, it's like actually, and this is where like, posterior distributions, you can really, it's almost like doing an A/B test. Like we've got two players, and what's the probability that this guy is actually outperforming the other guy, even though the other guy might have been, a higher draft pick or something like that. And so you try and at least display, we try and at least display that visually and have those conversations. It's kind of, in my head at least, maybe I'm wrong, but a nice way of like helping people understand the uncertainty, which is really important. Always try, I used to work with a guy who, whenever we'd present some of this stuff at work, and he'd be like, stop doing that. Like every time you present, you talk about like what the uncertainty and the assumptions and the limitations are. Like, just give them the answers. And I'm like, well, it's important that they know what the limitations are and what assumptions are behind this, because we don't want to talk past the sale and sell them on something that, isn't really there. Like there's been times where I've had to stop someone and just be like, hold on. this analysis definitely can't tell us that. Like that, what you're saying right now, it can't tell us that. So like, let's not try and make this more than it is. And also just, conveying your uncertainty. I mean, that's just super important because it's really, really hard. I mean, we're all going to fail at trying to identify talent. It's really hard to identify why one player is going to succeed over another. And so, in some way, it's not binary. It's not like, do you like this guy or not? Is he good or bad? Is this guy better or worse than the other guy? There's a lot of factors that go into why someone has success. And so I think conveying that uncertainty is really important. And obviously, the more observations that we have of you doing the thing, the more certain we are that this is your true level of performance. But it takes a while to get there. So we have to just be honest about that.
Yeah. I think that's actually related to something I wanted to ask you about also a bit more generally, but the most significant challenges that you face when applying Bayesian stats in sports science and how you address them, because I'm guessing that you already started talking a bit about that. So let's go there, and then I have other technical questions for you, but the kind of models and usefulness that Bayesian stats has in your field. But I think this is a good moment to address these questions.
I think the biggest, or there's a few challenges. One challenge is not everybody is excited about a posterior distribution like you might be. So most of the time, they
I
just
do not
want
understand that.
Yeah, I don't get it either. Most of the time, they just want an answer. But tell me what to do. Give me the yes or no. Make it binary. Whatever.
Yeah.
And so that's always tough. And you're trying to oftentimes convey this to non-technical audiences or people who are good at doing other things. They're not math people or they're not stats people, and that's okay. So that always makes it challenging. Is why are you showing me this distribution? I don't understand what I'm supposed to take from this. Just tell me what to do. Tell me which guy's better. Tell me which guy's worse. So that's always hard. And that takes a lot of, patience and communication. For a while we used to do just weekly sit downs with our scouts where we would teach them about like one stat a week. And, and we'd like go slow and we'd also try and, as best as possible, relate things back to the currency that they speak in. And scouts and coaches, the currency they speak in is video, not charts and graphs. So the more that we can connect our analysis to video cut-ups, because then they can see it. And then they understand why a model says what it says or makes a decision or why it has assumptions. And this is also super valuable too, because they give feedback and they say, it's saying that, the model is saying that this is the outcome, but I can see why. It's because these 4 other things happen. It's like, oh, wow. Well, we could probably account for that. And I just didn't know it, right? That's why they're a domain expert and I'm not. So the patience around communicating stats and numbers is always difficult. And also knowing what people like. When I first started, everybody would tell you need to have, you got to have an amazing dashboard, got to have like charts and graphs, and all that stuff. And what I found was there was a lot of people who were like, I don't even know what I'm looking at. Like, I hate these things. Just give me the table of numbers. It's like, oh, okay, well, maybe a table of numbers with just some conditionally formatted information. And also, I have an academic side. So I do supervise PhD students and master students, and I do teach a master's class in statistics at a college. So I guess what I'm about to say would, people on the academic side would hate it, but you have to like recognize the environment you're in, and sometimes just like changing the verbiage helps. Like, instead of calling things the low credible interval and the high credible interval, like we just call it the floor and the ceiling. And people are like, oh yeah, this guy's floor, it's a bit higher than the other guy's floor. And that guy's ceiling, this guy's got a better ceiling. And like, academically you'd get shot for that, but it's like those kinds of things go a long way because it brings the information to the end user. And if you want them to start to take this information into their decision calculus, you have to get them comfortable. And sometimes it's just meeting them with terminology that helps. And so I think that's a really, that's a big one. Those are big challenges in communicating this stuff. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I resonate with that. I've had the same issues. I'll be able to to talk more precisely about sports in a few months. But when it comes to a lot of other fields, whether it's marketing or biostats or electoral forecasting, it's the issues are related to these. They're also extremely diverse, so that's interesting. You definitely don't have a one-size-fits-all. Definitely what's extremely important basically is to know the model extremely well from my experience. And if you have coded the model yourself, you usually know it really well because you spent hours on it to try and get it to work and understand what it's doing and when it's not able to do, as you were saying. I think it's extremely important to be able to tell people what the model cannot tell you. And I think these are extremely good points to try and balance what people are usually wondering about. And that's also where I think having the Bayesian model is extremely interesting, right? Because the Bayesian model by definition is extremely open box and you have to write down your assumptions. And so you know much better what the model is doing than a black box model.
Yeah, that's another good point is if you go into a meeting and you have model outputs and your only reason when asked, why does it prefer this over that? Your only reason is because the model said so. Mm-hmm. People aren't going to be super excited about that. So knowing why things are happening, this also, this really plays into like how you validate and check your models. And so building, we kind of within that Bayesian sort of world, building simulations is a big part of it. And building simulations to see how the model behaves under different constraints and different pieces of information, that's really important because it gives you useful context to talk about, and it gives you useful information in order to head things off at the pass when there's going to be some gotchas and some trouble if people have certain types of questions. You can head things off at the pass because you're already aware of them. Another thing that I do think is really useful in this, and maybe in some of your prior work in consulting, I'm sure you've stumbled on or used, frameworks like CRISP-DM and things like that. Like in statistics, there's the PPDAC, problem, plan, data, analysis, and conclusion. Those types of frameworks help just because, again, a lot of times we're dealing with non-technical audiences and they're trying to give you a question and say hey, can we look at this? And oftentimes these things are very vague and very sort of not clearly defined. And my younger self would take that and run away and, do something for a week or two and then come back and be like, hey, here's this thing, and you asked about. And, they're usually the reply is, that's kind of cool, but I was thinking of it like this, and I would do this with it. And it's like, oh man, if you told me that 2 weeks ago, I would have done something else. So using those kinds of frameworks, it does a few things. One, it gives us the opportunity, I always tell our analysts, question the question, question the questioner, right? So when they have a question, I'm always sitting there and I'm like, okay, well, what would you want to do with this? How do you foresee yourself using it to make a decision? What's the cadence that you would need to access this information? If I were to get it to you tomorrow, what kind of decision would you want to make? Like really kind of Socratic questions, question the question. And that does a few things. One, we get to two, usually two different results. Both of them are good. The first is I get them to then walk through that 5 minutes with me and clearly define what it is they're looking for. That's great. The other result is the opposite, but it's also a good result, which is we get about 3 minutes in and they go, you know what? I haven't thought about this well enough. Let me think through it a bit more and come back to you. In which case I didn't waste the time building things and scraping and cleaning data and doing all that stuff. The other thing that those frameworks do is, and I try and get analysts to think like this, is utilize each step within those frameworks as touch points back to the person who asked you the question. Hey, this is where we're at. We've collected this kind of data. These are the things we're thinking. These are the features that we're thinking about using. What do you think about that? Anything else you can think of? By doing that, along each step of the way, they get to see the model developed. They get to provide input. And what that does is it gives them a bit of ownership over it. So when you get to the end result, they're like, geez, this was built exactly in my vision, and now I'm excited to use it. And that's a really cool thing too.
Yeah. Thanks for that detailed answer, Patrick. I can definitely hear the 10 years of experience working on that. That makes me think about a lot of other things. And yeah, definitely the same for me, I would say. Where my personal evolution has been trying to really understand the question the consumer of the model is trying to get to, right? Like, what actually is your question? Because you have something in mind, but maybe the way we're talking about it right now and the way I have it in mind is not what you want. And so, yeah, as you were saying, a good model is really, that's custom made, that's fine and hard work, and that takes time. And so before investing all that time in doing the model, let's actually make sure we align and agree on what we're actually looking at and studying. I think that's extremely important.
Yeah, no doubt. I think that's often the hardest part, because it's just getting people to really define, and that's probably, that and making sure that you have good data. Those are the two biggest things. The model buildings part and things like that are sort of happen a little bit easier once you do the first two things. That's always the tough part.
Yeah. Actually, continuing on that topic, how do you communicate these statistical concepts? And honestly, a lot of them are really complex. So how do you communicate that to non-stats people and in your line of work? I'm guessing that would be scouts, as you talked about, coaches, players. How do you make sure they understand what you're doing and in the end are able to use it? Because we talked about that in episode 108 with Paul Sabin. Like, if your model is awesome but not used, it's not very interesting. So yeah, how do you do that?
First, by trying to really understand what kind of cadence this is going to be on. So some questions, especially in sport, get asked, and they're more asked from the knowledge generation standpoint, meaning that I have a question. I think it'll help us with, updating our prior beliefs about the game. Maybe things have changed. Maybe rule changes have altered things or something like that. Can we study this? A question like that for knowledge generation requires a different output than something that's like weekly or daily consumption. So if it's for knowledge generation, that's usually communicated in the form of like a short written report. The question at the top, the bottom line up front, here's the 4 bullet points, and then the nitty gritty. Like, this is how we went about studying it, charts and graphs. And usually it's like a page or two in a PDF or maybe like an interactive HTML file that they can see things and have a table of contents and go to different sections. If the question is directed at stuff that's required to be evaluated weekly or daily, like I need to see this every week because we're going to be evaluating, a certain player or an opponent, or I need to see this daily because it's player health related, something like that. We're always thinking in terms of like web applications. So how do I get, now I have to think through the full stack pipeline of like, where do we get the data? Where does it live in the database? What's the analysis layer? Kick it out to an output. Where's that output stored? And then how does the website ingest that output and make it consumable? And for that, it's usually some form of charts and graphs and a table. And usually it's interactive stuff. So they can sort and filter and hover over points and access the information. And as best as possible, I'm always thinking to try and develop that in the way that they're going to use it. So like I was sitting down, for example, today with our director of player health, and he was like, I'd love to have this information daily so that I can relay it to the new coaching staff. And I want to say it, say these things. Okay, great. I have all that information. I have all of those models, but come over to the whiteboard and draw for me the path that you want to take to going from sitting at your desk and reading the information from a web page to how you want to communicate it. And as soon as he started drawing it out, it's like, okay, I know exactly what to do now. That's perfect. Otherwise, I would have built something that in my head I thought would be useful, but maybe not useful to him. And then he uses like part of it, or maybe because he's super motivated, he's going to use it. And he's also going to use like 10 other things to get the other stuff he wants. But he's a nice guy and he doesn't want to tell me that it doesn't have all the things that he needs, And so then like 4 weeks later, I walk in his office. I'm like, what are you doing? It's like, I go here and then I get this information from this webpage, but then I go to this other 3 web pages to get this. I'm like, whoa. Why didn't you just tell me that? Like, I could make this all into one thing. Like, you don't have to, and so, that's a really important piece, is knowing how the data is going to be utilized, making sure that it's exactly in the order that the decision maker requires it.
Yeah, awesome points. Thanks for that, Patrick. And I think it's also very valuable to a lot of listeners because we're talking about a professional sports team here, but this is definitely transferable to basically, I think, any company where you're working with different people who are using the models but are not themselves producing the models. And it's like almost every company out there. So yeah, I think, and also from my experience doing consulting in a lot of different fields, I can definitely vouch for the things you've touched on here. So thanks a lot. That's definitely I think very valuable. To turn back a bit more to the technical stuff, because I see time is running, and I definitely want to touch a bit more on the sports side of things and how Bayesian stats is applied in the film. Obviously a very important part of your work is, I'm guessing, drafting players, player selection processes. How might Bayesian methods be applied here to improve the draft strategies in the player selection processes?
Yeah, well, again, like I think I said earlier, everybody's going to miss. Like it's impossible to be, have a good hit rate and always be picking players who are going to reach high level success. And a lot of that is just because, performance and talent are extremely right-tailed. You have a whole bunch of players that never make it. You have a small group that make it and are good enough to make it. You have an even smaller group that are good enough to make it and like really good to play all the time. And then you have a few Hall of Famers sprinkled in, right? So it's really right-tailed. So it is very hard to do this stuff. So, understanding or modeling your uncertainty, that's really important. And getting information from the domain experts. Scouts see things on film that we can't see in numbers, and vice versa. One of the values that we have is we can process way more players than any one human can actually watch. So we have the ability to build models that can identify players and hopefully get them over to the domain experts who have to then watch the film and write the reports and say like, hey, did you know this guy was really good in these things? This is his potential ceiling. And we think that we have, we think that this would be valuable for our team, right? Building models like that help us identify talent, give us a range of plausible outcomes. One, it helps us get information to the people who have to watch the film and make the decisions. Two, it helps us have discussions about, where the appropriate time to acquire people are. If you're sitting there, obviously, in the Major League Baseball draft, it'll be the same thing. Everybody knows who the first round picks are and the second round picks. It's after that things become pretty sparse. And if you can identify players that have unique abilities later in the draft, that opens up a lot of opportunities to select players that might be able to contribute successfully to your team. And so that's really where those models help us. The other area that they help us in is I always, talk about with our analysts, like, what is the benchmark that you're trying to beat? So every model, like, you can't just build a model. I mean, I remember one of our analysts, she had a model and she said, I built a model and I think it's really good. And I said, cool. How well does it do against the benchmark? And she's like, well, what do you mean? And I was like, well, like, how well does it do against if we just use, let's say, scout grades, or if we just use public perception? How well does it do historically against that? She's like, no, I don't care about that. Like, this model's just with their stats and, things. I was like, well, no, but you have to care about that, because if it's not better than those things, then why would we use it, right? You have to be able to beat that benchmark. And one of the areas where we can really beat a benchmark is when we combine the domain experts' information with the actual observed data information. And a Bayesian model allows us to do that, right? It allows us to take down the domain expert who's maybe scoring the player a certain way, writing information about the player. It allows us to take that information, mix it with the numbers, and get a model that is, man and machine, right? And those models beat our benchmark much better than any one of these alone, right? If we just use numbers, never watched any film, never, knew anything about the player, or if we just use domain expert information. When we combine those things, we tend to do a much better job. And so that's where, Bayesian analysis really helps us. And also, that's where you start to get interesting discussions about the floor and the ceiling of a player. Because now, once you run their posterior distribution and the domain expert's information is in there, and you're saying, Yeah, this guy, he's awesome at tackling, and he's gonna, he'll be a great tackler and blah blah blah. And these are his numbers, and the model says like, the numeric model says like, yeah, I think this guy's a pretty good tackler. And the domain expert's saying like, no, I watched him, and he doesn't play against great competition, but his technique is really bad. It's not going to translate against these bigger players. It's like, oh, well, that's not information that maybe our stats would have. But when we combine those two, bits of information, all of a sudden, our maybe overly bullish belief in this player gets brought down a bit, and that's utilizing the information like that is interesting, and it also makes it unique to the people that are in that room, the domain experts that you have in that room, and and things like that, and how you weight those things is really important. For our own analytics staff, we'll do things like we'll build our own separate models and have our own meetings, and we'll build our own analysis. So we'll have like independent models all against each other, and maybe we'll have them weighted, or we'll use like triangle prior and build them together and, mix them together and get posterior simulations. And we try and do those things in a way that allows us to understand all the plausible outcomes that might be relevant for this individual.
It's fascinating, yeah. And I really love about that field, the fact that you have to blend a lot of different information, like the domain knowledge from the scouts, the benchmark from the markets, the models that you have in-house, the also scientific knowledge of all the scientists that the team has inside of it. And that makes all of that much more complicated, right? I'm guessing sometimes as the modeler, you would probably be like, oh my God, that'd be so much easier if like we could just, run some very big neural network and that'd be done.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think it's what makes the thrill of that field, at least for me, is that that stuff is really hard. There is a lot of randomness. There is a lot of things we don't really understand either, and you have to blend all of these elements together to try and make the best decisions you can, even though you're not making the optimal decisions, as you are saying. And I think it's a fascinating field to study important decision making under uncertainty.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's the thing that's most interesting about it to me. Like, yeah, I think that's the most, that stuff is fascinating. Just knowing that, decision-making under uncertainty is it's really challenging. And I think that's the thing that makes this the most, the coolest stuff to work on. Yeah.
No, definitely. Actually, maybe a last question on the technical side. Now, if we look, so we've talked about the beginning of the career of a player, right? Like the draft. We've talked about kind of the whole lifetime of the player, which is projection, performance projection over the whole career. Now, I'm wondering about the day-to-day stuff. What can Bayesian models tell us here, or how can they help us in predicting the impact of training loads on the athlete's well-being and performance? I think it's kind of a frontier in almost all the sports, but I'm curious what the state of the art here is, especially in US football.
Yeah, it really is. I think the sort of one of the final frontiers, I guess, in sport. Team sport is just challenging because you perform well, or you win or you lose, due to a whole bunch of issues that sometimes have nothing to do with you. For example, I can train you. We could train you, and you could be very fit and strong. And if in the last play of the game, the quarterback throws the ball to a patch of grass and you lose, it had nothing to do with you being fit and strong. Counter that to like individual sport athletes. If you're a 400-meter runner, a cyclist, a swimmer, a runner, a marathoner, physiologically, if we build you up, we have a much more direct line between how you developed and how it directly relates to your performance. There's not a lot of other information there. No one's trying to tackle you on the bike or in the pool or something like that. So that makes sport much more difficult. Baseball's probably the closest, because even though it is a team sport, it really is this sort of zero-sum duel between a pitcher and a batter, and one guy wins and one guy loses. And the events are very discrete. The states of the game have been played out, runner on first and second with 2 outs, bottom of the third, blah, blah, blah. So it's maybe a little bit more clear in baseball. I think in the other team sports, in the kind of invasion sports, what makes this challenging is identifying. I always try and take it back to identifying the discrete events that we're trying to maybe measure against. So, like, for example, I can give you a pretty clear example from basketball. I was talking with a friend in an NBA team, and he was like, "Yeah, our coach and our scouts and our coaches, they feel like our players don't close out 3-pointers fast enough." And I was like, "Well, is that a tactical problem or is it a physical problem?" And he's like, "Well, how would we look at that?" And I was like, "Well, if you have the player tracking data, and if every time your team's on defense, which is easy to know, and every 3-pointer that's been shot against your defense, if you were to take that frame out of the player tracking data and maybe like the frame a second to a second and a half before that, so all of that information for every one of those 3-pointers, you have an idea of the relationship between your player and the player who's taking the 3-point shot. You have an idea of the relationship between your player and the other players on his team. So from a tactical standpoint, what type of like formation or defense you're trying to run. So first things first, are the players in the right position to close out that 3-pointer? Maybe, our guys consistently mess up the defensive shape, and when they get in there, they give too much ground to the guy shooting a 3-pointer. The other is the physical standpoint of, well, no, they're in good position, but when they go to close it out over that second and a half, they're not fast enough to get there. Okay, great. Now roll it back to what you can measure in the gym. Is there some measure, let's say, on a force plate of the amount of impulse or force under the force time curve that the player outputs that can tell us something about their ability to move rapidly, apply force into the ground, move rapidly to close out that 3-pointer? And maybe if you look at several years worth of data, you'd find that the top players on your team all do this thing really well, and some of the worst players at closing out the 3 do this thing poorly. And so now you have something to say about like, hey, what if we develop this quality in the offseason in our players? Would we be able to close out the 3-pointers more effectively, more efficiently? And so I think from that standpoint, linking the development piece to sport, team sport, invasion sport, you have to really think about the discrete events of the game and how you can kind of tease those out of, let's say, the player tracking data. And it's like super hard in something like, in football, because players all do really different things. The linebacker does something totally different than the offensive lineman. And so you have to really get down to the domain of each of those positions and say like, gosh, what are the discrete events that define what this position does? And then how do we measure success in those? And then if we can measure success, how do we identify the archetype of players who are good at those things? And then if we can do that, maybe then we can start to talk about, is this something that you can develop in a player? Is it something that you have to identify in a player? Like that's sort of the in my head, I mean, I don't know. I could be wrong. This is not nobody. I think everybody's trying to figure this out, but I could be wrong. But in my head, that's at least the process that I would, I try and think through when I think about these things.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes a ton of sense. I mean, and it seems like, and there are so many open areas of research on all of that stuff. That's just fascinating. I'm already thinking, oh, that'd be amazing to have like a huge Bayesian model where you have all of those topics that we've talked about. Basically, could be in a big Bayesian model where you have a bunch of likelihoods. And like that'd be super fun. I'm guessing we're still a bit far from that, but maybe not too far, so hopefully in a few years that'd be definitely super fun.
Yeah, no doubt.
I mean, and that's definitely doable, but you need really good data and you need really good structure in your model.
That's the hard part too, is getting good data. Player tracking data is fine. I mean, it has errors. People who think that it's like a panacea, it's like, have you really worked with it? I mean, there's sampling at 10 hertz for humans that move really, really fast. Well, I mean, if acceleration is a derivative of speed, and at 10 hertz, people who are moving really fast, that data gets noisy pretty quick. So I think one of the things is as we progress, as the technology keeps improving, things get better, and you get better data, and maybe that helps you also answer some of these questions a little bit more specifically.
Yeah. And then we'll be able to have our huge Bayesian model with a lot of different likelihoods in there that feed into each other. And
then we don't even need to play the game. We don't have to play the game. They just let the computers play the game, and it's over. We're done.
No, you still have to play the game because you still have
randomness.
Then you're like, I mean, because otherwise the model is kind of like, if you want kind of in a quantum state, right, where like the model can see the probabilities of things happening, but then you have to open the box and see what is actually happening. So, I mean, you can have the best model. In the end, you still have to play the game to see what's going to happen because it's not deterministic. Thankfully. So,
that's right.
Yeah. But I mean, it's definitely, I always love doing these big models. And that's definitely doable. I've done that for election forecasting, for instance, where you have several likelihoods, one for polls, for instance, and one for elections. I know that's definitely doable in the Bayesian framework because, I mean, why not? It's just part of the same big model, directed acyclic graph, if you want. But like, I'm curious to see that done in sports. Maybe we'll get back together for another episode, Patrick, where we talk about that and how we did that. That'd be cool.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to ask you to close us out here about, you've started talking about that right now, like some emerging trends in sports analytics that you believe will significantly impact how teams manage training, performance, drafting in the near future. And also, if there are any sports you see as more promising than others.
Well, I mean, trends. We talked a lot about that stuff, and I think better data and better better technology. All of those things will help us. I think also it's getting getting the decision makers comfortable with the utility of some of this stuff. Baseball has always been a game of numbers, and I think maybe mid 2000s, early 2004, 5, 6, 7, releasing data kind of to the public, really the first sport to get player tracking data, things like that. I think that opened up a lot of opportunities for people to do really interesting work in the public space, which then sort of got teams interested, and then sort of a more of a shift in people in the front office, where maybe historically it was ex-players who kind of played out until they retired and then became scouts and managers and things like that. I think that that happening in baseball was a really good thing for that sport, and I think slowly for the other sports, that's really what probably needs to happen, because the more that these things are open and sort of curbside, I think the more the decision makers become comfortable with them and can say like, oh, I can see how I would use this. I can see what this might help me with. And so I think that's how never underestimate the work that you do in the public space, because I think there's an opportunity to always, help things evolve. Crowdsourcing, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, preaching to the choir here. I mean, for me, a lot more of these data would be open sourced. Right. And I mean, there is also an extremely interesting trend right now towards open sourcing more and more parts of large language models. Mm-hmm. And I think that's going to be extremely interesting to see that develop, because at the same time, this is very hard because these kind of models are just so huge. You need a lot of computing power to make them run. So I don't know how open source can help in that, but I know how open source can help in the development and sustainability and trustworthiness and openness of all that stuff. So that's going to be super interesting. And I'm also going to be very interested in how the different sports evolve now that basically the nerds are there much more, right, than before, so like, probably baseball is going to be at the forefront of that, because they just have a lot of advance in years compared to the other sports. So it's going to be interesting to see how things plays out here when it comes to data, because at the same time, not sure it makes a lot of sense for all the clubs to have their own data collection structure if in the end they just have the same data, because you're mainly I think to gather data you are limited, I'm guessing, by the technology much more than by the ideas of a coach or a manager or a scientist being like, oh, I like data, but that I think in the end, like, the data collection is something that can be pretty much collective, but then how you use the data is more the proprietary stuff. It's going to be interesting to see that playing out.
No doubt.
Great. Well, Patrick, I've taken a lot of your time already. I need to let you go, because you need to drink some coffee. I definitely need to, because that was very, very intense. But man, so interesting. Before letting you go, so I have the last two questions, of course, as usual. But you told me before we started the show that when the season is gonna start again, for you in US football, your days are gonna be extremely busy, like basically working from 5 a.m. to 10 p.m. or something like that. So how is that possible? And when do you sleep?
We do have some long days. It depends on the day of the week and when the full practice days are. Usually, I'd get in around 4:45 or 5, have a bit of a workout, and then kind of start the day around 6:30 or 7. And it's really long. I mean, there's a ton of meetings. It's a very tactical sport if you've ever watched it. And so the players are nonstop in and out of meetings and walk-through practices and full practices and then more meetings. And it's all a big, tactical pattern recognition type of thing. And so, we're in, working on projects and data and getting, things set up so that models set up and identifying things in data for the staff and things like that. So it just becomes this really long day. And I mean, if we go home at 8 or 9, maybe 9:30 sometimes, maybe 10. But there's people there that'll stay even later than that, just going through film and watching. They are very long days. Usually those types of days are about 3 days a week. And then the other days, I might be in there at 5 and get out at 5 or 6. So still 12-hour days, but it's a long, it's a long week for sure.
This is brutal. Yeah. But is it like that during the whole season, or is that mainly the start of the season?
No, that's the season. That is, this is a 18 weeks. We have a bye. 17 game season. Yeah.
Damn, impressive. Yeah, so you have to be sharp with your sleep also, I guess, in these weeks.
You do, yes.
Yeah.
You try and catch up on the weekends.
Yeah. Damn. Awesome. Well, Patrick, I think it's time to call it a show. Thank you so much. That was amazing. Of course, I'm gonna ask you the last 2 questions. Ask every guest at the end of the show. You knew that was coming, right?
I knew it was coming.
So,
yes.
Yes. So what's the first one? You know the first one?
The first one is, if unlimited resources, what problem would you solve?
Yeah, unlimited time and resources.
On time
Which
and
problem
resources,
would you solve? Yeah.
I'll take one outside of sport, but one that I witnessed in sport. And so when I first started, I used to do all of the GPS stuff, live on the field. Now someone else does it, but coding it or cutting it up and stuff like that during practice. And on Friday practices at the time, that was the day for our Make-A-Wish. The Make-A-Wish child would come. So they'd have kids that had Make-A-Wish, and their wish was to see a practice and meet their favorite NFL players. And these were usually kids that were small and terminally ill. I think that's probably the thing that I would solve, because standing there and you watch that and you work with all these guys that are healthy and young, and then you see this little kid who will never have a chance to get healthy and young, but they're just so happy to meet these guys. I think that's a super unfair thing for those little kids. So if I could solve anything, it'd be like that, kids and cancer and stuff like that. I think it's just a horrible thing.
Yeah.
And then your second question is always, if I could have dinner with anyone, dead or alive, who would it be? There's so many good ones, but I think I would pick a previous guest that you've had, I think 3 times, if I'm correct, which is Andrew Gelman. I think he's fascinatingly interesting, and I think dinner would be pretty amazing.
Yeah, well, yeah, both good choices, amazing answers. Thanks, Patrick. And I can tell you're faithful listeners, because they you knew the questions. You're taking my job, basically. I can see that. No, that's great. So Andrew, if you're listening, well, if you're ever in New York, Patrick, we'll try and make that work. That'd be fun for sure. Yeah, Andrew is always fantastic to talk to. So yeah, that's definitely a great choice. Awesome. Well, that's it, Patrick. Thank you so much for being in the show. I really had a blast. Learned a lot about US football, because I think that's not the sport I know most about. So definitely thank you so much for taking the time. We'll put resources to your website in the show notes for those who want to dig deeper. We have a bunch of links over there. And thank you again, Patrick, for taking the time and being on the show.
Thank you.
This has been another episode of Learning Bayesian Statistics. Be sure to rate, review, and follow the show on your favorite podcatcher, and visit learnbaystats.com for more resources about today's topics, as well as access to more episodes to help you reach true Bayesian state of mind. That's learnbaystats.com. Our theme music is Good Bayesian by Baba Brinkman, feat. MC Lars and Megaran. Check out his awesome work at bababrinkman.com. I'm your host, Alex Andorra. You can follow me on Twitter at Alex_Andorra, like the country. You can support the show and unlock exclusive benefits by visiting patreon.com/learnbaystats. Thank you so much for listening and for your support. You're truly a
good Bayesian. Change your predictions after taking information in. And if you're thinking I'll be less than amazing, let's adjust those expectations. Let me show you how to be a good Bayesian. Change calculations after taking fresh data in. Those predictions that your brain is making, let's get them on a solid foundation.